welcome to the Grassman vlog. You might have seen our other video where we are traveling back to Georgia from Ohio from an alfalfa intensive training. And we're going to do another short little video with a couple of questions that I've been picking Dennis's brain with since I'm studying for an exam.
Not much left to pick.
So, if you didn't, watch our other video, I'm Taylor Hendricks. I'm a PhD student. This is Britta. She's an MS student, and then the Grassman himself is in the vehicle. So, yeah, I have a couple questions, and I think Britta has a question for you. So, you ready? We're trying to get hard now.
Mostly ready.
Mostly ready.
We'll see how it goes.
Okay. So my first question is, what can we do, or is there anything that we can do in terms of pasture management to maybe reduce some metabolic issues or some lameness issues because of carbohydrate content in forages, specifically in horses?
Ooh, you're going to get me in trouble, aren't you?
I have to study. Come on.
Yeah, I think the only reason you're asking these questions is because you want a better grade in the horse class. So
Dr. Duberstein, I am studying.
You've been laying out a class the last 3 days and you're trying to get brownie points on it.
Pretty much.
So, yes, there are some things that we can do from a grazing perspective and some considerations, I guess, from pasture management on, particularly for horses that are sensitive to high carbohydrate loads in their diet, because some horses have a predisposition to what's known as equine metabolic syndrome. And I guess the closest analogy to the human problem would be diabetes. So it's a scenario where the animal, for whatever reason, has some challenges with nutrition and carbohydrate loading and causing laminitis, lameness, and that sort of thing that can result from that. And so, yeah, there's some forage related issues that come along with that. And probably one of the biggest challenges that we have is sometimes with ryegrass. Annual ryegrass tends to be very high in simple sugars, and those can really kind of jumpstart that EMS challenge to the horse. So if you do have a horse that is predisposed to EMS problems, then maybe choosing species that have lower concentrations of those sugar contents. Generally speaking, Bermuda grass is one of the better choices. Bermuda grass or Bahia grass are low because they're warm season perennials. They're generally low in those simple sugars because they store carbohydrates primarily as starch. Much less of the simple sugars like the fructans and even simple as glucose sometimes in some of the other species. So grazing management is also important too, because the lower you graze those cool season grass pastures, the more you're going to have that fructan loading. So grazing management such as you don't graze it all the way down will be really good. And also rotationally grazing is always a good practice anyway for keeping good uniformity of grazing in those horse pastures anyway. Oftentimes horses tend to be what I call recreational grazers. They tend to hang out in certain areas and they graze more in those areas. And if we do a good job of rotational grazing, we even that out. We don't have the overgrazed areas and the undergrazed areas causing weed problems and that sort of thing. Usually that's requiring rapid rotations. In other words, they're only in there for 2 or 3 days. We move them to another pasture, and we're not forcing them to take it all the way down either. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, are there any species that are good co-grazers with horses? I know sometimes we discuss sometimes sheep or goats with cattle can be good in terms of parasites and some selective grazing there. Is there anything with horses we can do to help even that out?
Yeah, horses tend to only graze grass. I mean, they really don't like to graze anything but grass. And they'll nibble around at clover and they'll nibble around at other species, browse that might be in the pasture. But for the most part, they tend to focus on grass. But if you take another species, kind of the other end of the spectrum is goats. If we have a goat out there, those goats tend to prefer broadleaf plants. They tend to prefer clover, browse species, things that the horses aren't going to eat. So they actually match really, really well with one another. Sometimes there's a concern about parasite loads, one having high parasite loads and maybe giving it to the other. And to a large degree, that's not too big of an issue because most of those internal parasites are species specific. In other words, horses have their parasites, goats have theirs. And if we're doing any kind of rotation, going back to that idea of rotational grazing, we actually help break that disease cycle, that insect cycle that is, well, in this case, a disease. It's, those barber pole worms or whatever the intestinal parasite is. We break that cycle, and so that really helps it. And if we're not grazing it all the way into the ground, we're not picking up as many of the parasites and the eggs and that sort of thing when we're not grazing it really tight. So, yeah, great question.
Excellent.
So one of the things you mentioned as a possible way to help with the metabolic issues is Bermuda grass, but I know that some people have said that there's issues with Bermuda grass colic in horses.
Oh yeah, so the old Bermuda grass is going to kill my horse routine, huh?
Pretty much.
Yeah. It's funny that Bermuda grass doesn't do that at all. I mean, it's fine.
Good response.
No doubt, and I guess I'm being a little facetious, but the reality is occasionally we do get colic in horses. And some horses, once they've colicked once, they tend to be chronic colicers. So, yes, we can get high, low quality forage, high instances of colic and impaction. And really what we're talking about is a disruption of digestive flow through the intestines of these animals. And yes, we can run into issues with that with Bermuda grass, but we can run into issues with that with any grass. In most of the experience that we've had over the years with that, fiber content is extremely important. Okay, the first rule is the NDF level, which is a measure of fiber. NDF is neutral detergent fiber. It's all of the fiber that's in that forage. Needs to be less than 65% of that forage. All right, so the other 35% is easily digestible. It's stuff that you or I could digest if we consumed it. But the 65% or less rule is to make sure we're not dealing with an ultra high fiber diet going into those animals. So if you have something less than that, your risk of colic is greatly reduced. The other factors that affect this, though, are how we handle those horses. A horse that's out grazing in a pasture, rarely is it going to colic. Even if it's eating Bermuda grass, even if it's low quality Bermuda grass, it's rarely going to colic. And the reason being is that animal usually has access to forage all throughout the day. They can graze that entire time. But if you contrast that with a horse that may be in a stall and it's kept boarded up all the time, those horses may only be fed once or twice a day. And horses, by their nature, the way the good Lord intended it, they want it's supposed to have a full gut all the time. All right. And the problem is that in boarding situations, oftentimes they're fed once or twice a day and really not sustained with a good level of forage all throughout the day. The second issue related to that is very closely related to that, is they may not have adequate water through the whole day. I've been in horse barns where they only water once a day, and that's a very dangerous thing to be doing. So adequate water, adequate feed throughout the whole day. And the third thing is related to that as well, is exercise, getting those animals out and exercising. If they're stuck in that stall all day, they're not able to really get any kind of exercise. And exercise for a horse is crucial because it stimulates gut motility. It stimulates the passage rate. So it's extremely important. You've all seen this, right? You go to a parade and you see the horses walking down the parade. What do? they crap the entire time they're in the parade. And then the marching band has to come walking through. So the key is to have some exercise, right? And so low fiber, plenty of forage, plenty of water, plenty of exercise, and your chronic issues with colic are more or less going to go away. It's a big help from that standpoint.
Okay. So we discussed a little bit earlier doing some co-grazing with different species, potentially sheep or goats or small ruminants and horses or cattle or whatever. So, and you kind of touched on the parasite load. So there's something I ran across in some literature the last couple weeks that discussed the role of sericea lespedeza and the anthelmintic properties of it. So I'm wondering, how does that work? Is it really effective as they say it is? And if it is, why aren't we using it?
Yep, sericea lespedeza is a great choice for this, and sericea is kind of an interesting story because for us it's a great forage, but if you go to Kansas or Oklahoma, they cuss that stuff like crazy. It is a major noxious weed out there. But for us, it's a great legume. It's a good forage legume. It's high in what's called condensed tannins, and condensed tannins actually. The tannin part of that, by the way, is the same compound that we use to tan hide to make that hide a little harder and that sort of thing. And what happens with tannins in this forage is that as the animal consumes it, those tannins actually bind with proteins. That's why they're used for tanning leather. And those tannins bind with proteins, and in the case of the barber pole worm, which is one of the more common intestinal parasites, the barber pole worm actually exudes a little protein as it's getting ready to attach to the intestinal wall. And what ends up happening is that condensed tannin more or less binds with that protein and prevents that protein from coming in contact with the intestinal wall. And so the barber pole worms just kind of flush right through the digestive system of the animal, and thereby reducing the populations that are causing problems. It works great in small ruminants. The data is clear. Our friends down at Fort Valley State University have done a lot of work with that, and LSU has done a lot of work with that. Ray Kaplan at the University of Georgia has done a lot of work with that too. He's our parasitologist. So it works great. And it probably would work also and has some merit to be feeding to beef cattle. Maybe not to horses. We don't know yet on horses. We really don't know yet clearly on beef cattle either. Part of it has to do with the variation in internal parasite species that we deal with. Some species are more challenged in that regard than others, and this would be more effective against. So we don't really know just yet, but we certainly know that in small ruminants, in sheep and in goats, it's really a great tool. And a lot of folks are now making pellets out of sericea lespedeza and feeding that to their small ruminants, and it works great. One of the reasons we don't use it much on beef cattle side is it's a little harder to get established. It's a little expensive for what you get out of it. There are many better options from a forage yield standpoint and forage quality for that matter. Growing sericea lespedeza, even if you're cutting it for hay, it can get extremely woody and extremely mature on you, so kind of low quality. I remember as a kid, we used to make sericea lespedeza hay, and some of that can be extremely mature, and I've worn out blue jeans bucking bales with sericea lespedeza because it's so woody and so strong. So yeah, we have there's some opportunities with it, particularly for pelleting, but there are some challenges associated with it as well. So
awesome.
All right.
Are y'all questioned out?
I think so.
I think so.
Think you earned enough horse or credit in the horse course?
Well, let's hope. We'll find out.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and for Taylor and Britta,
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
we'll see you down the road.
All right.
Thanks.